Good afternoon with everybody. As it was announced, this is an event in English, so I will make my presentation in English. On behalf of the organizers of this event, the Center of Innovation for the Sustainable Development of Ecuador, CIDSE by its acronym in English, Zede del Litoral, and Guayaquil Space Society, it's my pleasure to give you a warm welcome to our guest speaker, retired Brigadier General Damon Feltman, and to our participants in this forum and conference. The topic of this event is how to develop an innovation system, and our guest speaker will link his experience as a distinguished member of the US Air Force and the US Space Force, in which, of course, innovation is a day-to-day element in their activities, to be able to give ideas of how we can, in Ecuador, also develop an ecosystem that promotes innovation. Precisely this initiative, which is led by Ingeniero Sergio Flores, who is our host today in this event, tries to have key players from all the fields, because innovation is applicable to any activity. And space is a very good reference, because space needs the top in technology, the top in innovation. And I want to link this with something that Ecuador did last year. In June of 2023, Ecuador became member of the Artemis Accords by signing an agreement with the US. This was done in the Ecuadorian embassy in Washington. And by doing that, we became part of a network of countries, now there are more than 30, that cooperate in any project that has to do with space exploration. And I have to say that was done with a lot of effort from the private sector, and to be honest, with a lot of effort from Guayaquil Space Society, so that we had to convince the government that it was something that was valuable for our country. The government at the time, after analyzing the project, accepted it, and that's how we became a member of this network of countries. But this is just an open door. We need to become part of projects. So if we don't improve our innovation, it is very difficult to think that we will be able to be an active part of a project that has to do with the next exploration in space era. So that is why we thought that a conference by Brigadier General Damon Feltman would be very timely, because we would link innovation with what's being done in space. And therefore, we think that we will contribute to the debate about how we can do this best in our country. After my welcoming remarks, Sergio Flores will explain to us about this initiative of CIDSE, and Robert Ailon, President of Guayaquil Space Society, will give a detailed presentation of our guest speaker. Welcome.
Muy buenas tardes. Bueno, la mía va en español. Bienvenidos de parte de la Zede del Litoral. Y aquí estamos tres instituciones, como decía Nelson, reunidos, el cual pues el Global Space, a la cual le agradecemos por la contribución del día de hoy, y a ti, Robert, por la colaboración. La Zede Litoral, que es la casa donde ustedes están, que es una zona de desarrollo económico basada en crear un ecosistema de innovación. Cosa muy difícil en este país, pero ahí vamos, ahí estamos. Y la tercera es que nos hemos reunido un grupo para hablar, conversar y hacer algo respecto al desarrollo económico y social del país. Cuando uno escucha de que América Latina tiene 180 millones de personas en la pobreza, esto es alrededor del 25% de América Latina, entonces uno dice, aquí hay que hacer algo. Y no hay que seguir haciendo lo mismo que ya se ha venido haciendo, como decía Einstein, es de tontos continuar haciendo lo mismo. Y quizás hacer algo como lo que propone Schumpeter, de una destrucción creativa o alguna otra cosa para poder salir de este estado de pobreza en que nos encontramos. Y parte de esto, indudablemente, y parte de este desarrollo va a través de, por ejemplo, mejorar las exportaciones, hacerlas más competitivas, hacerlas más productivas. Y esto está basado, como dicen los conocedores del tema, en tener una mejor complejidad económica. Y tener una mejor complejidad económica indica tener pues mejor uso de herramientas tecnológicas, y eso nos lleva de una u otra manera a que el único camino, o quizás uno de los pocos caminos, es el tema de innovación y transferencia tecnológica. No hablo de falsas industrias, sino hablo de innovación y tampoco estoy hablando de emprendimiento. Para hacer innovación hay que hacer emprendimiento, para hacer emprendimiento no hay que hacer innovación. Entonces hay que tener la claridad entre lo uno y lo otro. Pero el camino, uno de los pocos caminos, es a través de innovación, a través de transferencia tecnológica. Y esto pues es lo que nos ha llevado a pensar que este país necesita hablar de estos temas que lamentablemente no los hablamos, hablar de la necesidad de tener una estrategia, de tener una política pública al respecto, de ver el futuro, que veamos el futuro como debe ser. Entonces, hemos conformado un grupo al cual a los interesados los invitamos a asociarse, que se llama CIDSE, el Centro de Innovación y Desarrollo Sostenible del Ecuador, con la idea de seguir hablando, de seguir trabajando en esto y de crear una conciencia de que este país necesita hacer algo nuevo, necesita hacer algo diferente al respecto. Y la sede litoral está relacionada porque este es un ecosistema para eso, que también pues estamos trabajando como Politécnica porque está relacionada con innovación y por ende aquí no se puede hablar de innovación si no se habla de investigación y si no hablamos de educación. Es toda una cadena que hay que trabajar. Entonces, esas somos las tres instituciones y ya Nelson habló más detalladamente de la parte espacial, que es uno de nuestros asociados a través de Robert. Damon, welcome home. We are really glad to have you here. I am sure that with your talk will inspire us about what to do in innovation, what to do about creativity, and what to do in the future. Thank you very much for your help and for your talk.
And for information of our guest speaker, we have here representatives and members of the following institutions: the Center of Innovation for the Sustainable Development of Ecuador, CIDSE, Zede del Litoral, Guayaquil Space Society, Guayas River Forum, Chamber of Industries of Guayaquil, Cluster for the Digital Transformation of Guayaquil, Spol University, US University, Naval Academy of Warfare, CEO of companies, academics, researchers, entrepreneurs, and analysts. So I leave Robert alone for the presentation of our guest speaker.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Sergio, for those kind words for our guest. I would like to introduce Damon Feltman as a friend, as an officer, as a long career brigadier general from the Space Force. He started early his career in the Air Force, where his passion led him to be curious about what the opportunities were He came from a very rural town where technology wasn't something that people thought, you know. Over there was working in factories, working in agriculture, so that's Damon's background. And that's what his family did. And through his family, he was able to get the necessary support to be able to start thinking about what else can I do? What new things can I do? How can I follow this curiosity that I'm interested in space, with the Apollo program, with the rockets, living in that world in the early 70s. And that led him, with excellent role models, to support him to start thinking about how can I follow this path? And he successfully transitioned to the Air Force, where he had a wonderful career over 30 years, being in charge of programs as a commander of the GPS satellites. So he had a satellite that he oversaw, that he provided the maintenance, and he had a crew that he worked early on at a very young age to start thinking about how can we provide the right connectivity to the world, to start thinking about how do we drive, how do we use our phones, how do we connect. And then start thinking about other space missions, other responsibilities, and then ultimately, as the United States government decided to give more prominence to a new agency, the Space Force, he became a general in the Space Force. And then he decided to retire, enjoy his life, but the civilian call for space was still so strong. And he went to work for the Space Development Agency. And the Space Development Agency is a very important institution in the United States that they do provide a lot of work regarding what happened with satellites. So he was working on a huge project about creating a constellation of satellites for communications, over 100 satellites that are going to be starting to launch next year. So that career path, now Damon decided, no, let's change of pace, spend more time with the family. So he decided to retire this year. But again, the call for space is too strong. Now he's here talking to us about space. And Damon is now looking to start a new chapter in his life as a consultant with his own business about space consulting and how to help companies and entrepreneurs and organizations about thinking about what are the challenges and how do I prepare for that. So I could definitely stay here speaking about Damon, my friend, also for a long time. He was a very prominent leader for the Thunderbird School of Global Management space program that launched 2 years ago. And his leadership there for the program provided lots of guidance for all the first-year students as they graduated and completed this amazing one-year program of the next generation of future leaders in space for the United States. And now he continues working and providing this very open message about what space can do for all of us, and that it's not closed, but it's an invitation for us to participate. And with that, Damon, I would like to invite you to come here, and we're so eager to hear your words. Thank you so much for coming to Ecuador.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Sergio, for the invitation to come here and for the time that we're about to spend together. The kind introduction was very humbling. So if I may, Robert did give a good overview of who I am, but I'll introduce myself a little bit further just so you know who is taking up your Tuesday afternoon. So I've had the great blessing of spending 32 years plus a little bit of time with the Air Force and Space Force missions. I ran satellite operations for many years. I had crews, spacecraft operations crews working for me, integrating space into joint air and space campaigns around the world, commanding space operations organizations, setting up space systems, helping establish United States Space Command, and building the budget for the Space Force in my last assignment. Since retiring from the military a year ago, I worked as a civilian for the Space Development Agency. Well, you know what? I was supposed to do that, wasn't I? I was supposed to do that. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah. Since retiring from the military, I was a civilian at the Space Development Agency and supporting the acquisition, the technical strategy for first 126 spacecraft going up next year, and then there's another 172 going up a short time after that. So almost 300 satellites. I had the technical roadmap for those. I'm sorry? Yes, this is me. So this is me. I was about 13, 14 years old at Space Camp in Huntsville, Alabama. And so I've recently retired from that line of work, and I've started a consulting company focused mainly on the space industry. So before we go much further, I do want to point out that, let's see, there we go. I've spent a lot of time in the federal government of the United States. My comments here are mine. They are not representative of the U.S. government. They're not representative of the Space Force, Department of Defense, et cetera. I'm going to do my best to give you sources of the material that I present, so that you know where that comes from, and then let you know what comments are mine. At the end of all of this, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if I don't hit something that you want, just let me know at the end. We can cover just about anything related to space that you want to. In the time we have, I want to walk you through what's been called the new space economy, and this photo collage here is a great way to contextualize what that phrase means if you're not familiar with it. So on the left, this is a rocket that is no longer used. It's called the Titan IV, and this is the launch of a payload called the Defense Support Program from 1994. So in 1994, I was 24 years old. I was a satellite crew commander on this launch for that satellite that's in the top middle there. And Defense Support Program was built to detect and report nuclear launches from the Soviet Union when that was still around. During the first Gulf War, we discovered that the optical sensor, infrared sensor here could also detect shorter range missiles like Scuds that were being used in the first Persian Gulf War, and it became the centerpiece of missile defense, short-range missile defense for the United States and its allies. The design of this satellite was set in the 1980s, and each of these satellites was handcrafted, hand-built, at a cost of about $375 million each in 1994 dollars. That's about $750 million today. And each satellite was about 33 feet long and about 5,200 pounds. I think I have that, yes. So that's what, 2,800 kilograms, I think. I don't have my glasses on. There's 2,300 kilograms. And like I said, about 2,300 kilograms. Meanwhile, the Titan was built at a cost of about $250 million each. So one satellite and one rocket together was $125 million in US dollars in 1994, or about $1.25 billion in today's dollars per spacecraft, per launch. And at this time, we flew multiple of these spacecraft. So to ensure global coverage and more than one spacecraft looking at areas of interest around the world. So the cost of fielding the system was several billions of dollars for this one capability. So let's contrast this environment to the right. There we go. On the right, you see a launch of a Falcon 9 booster. This launch was for the Space Development Agency where I used to work, and it launched several prototype missile warning and space data tracking satellites. Space data transmission satellites. And there are some differences between the requirements on the missile warning side of what Space Development Agency did and what I did as a young man. Some differences, but for the sake of the dialogue we're having here, let's just consider those pretty much equal capabilities. So 1994 versus 2024. If all goes to plan, next year, Space Development Agency will launch 44 missile warning and missile tracking spacecraft in its Tranche 1 program. We will launch them 11 at a time So 11 spacecraft on one rocket. And the cost for those 11 plus the rocket will be about $750 million. So at a per unit cost, it's about $44 million a piece. And you can see some of the parameters of how the spacecraft are, but I think it's safe to say that the cost magnitude has shifted dramatically from, at least when I was a kid, and this was 30 years ago, when you have $1.25 billion for one vehicle versus $750 million for 11 vehicles, doing effectively the same type of mission. And this is a great way to kind of contextualize just the shift in cost that has occurred in recent years. So, emboldened by the early successes, and most visibly, most people are familiar with the success of SpaceX. Money has entered the space economy, entered the space markets, and this has allowed the U.S. government to shift how it procures space services. So, for example, NASA a few years ago, this was back in the Obama administration, started this program called the Commercial Resupply Program, where it would buy commercial boosters and commercial service modules to send supplies to the International Space Station. And NASA also has a commercial lunar program as well, where NASA is buying a service to fly things to the moon to do lunar research and bring material back from the moon. So instead of the U.S. government buying the equipment and procuring the equipment and owning the equipment and being the systems integrator for the equipment, we're now at a point where this technology can be bought as a service, and the companies now can work on a fixed price contract versus a extended duration contract that is, in the language of the DoD, we call it a cost plus contract, where the vendor has a fixed cost, but they get awards along the way. All of their costs are guaranteed to be covered, et cetera. So today, SpaceX has completely upended the launch market, and other markets are following. So satellite communications, which has been a mainstay of space activity for many years, is shifting dramatically. Companies like Starlink, which is a SpaceX company, Amazon's Kuiper, and several others are moving broadband communication to low Earth orbit, and you're able to get broadband connectivity anywhere in the world. Pretty soon you'll be able to get broadband connectivity across your cell phone with minimal special equipment required. And that will be a significant shift to how global telecommunications occurs. So this new space economy dialogue has had a lot of energy behind it in recent years. This quote that I'm going to show you here is from Morgan Stanley, global financial services company. In this report, I don't think I have the date on it, but it's just a few years old. They predicted that the global space economy would grow from $350 billion US dollars to $1 trillion by 2040. It made headlines everywhere in the space industry and in financial publications around the world. And it felt real when billionaires like Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk started doing things like this. This is Elon Musk when he launched his own personal Tesla with a spaceman inside of it. But they publicized their escapades, and space companies reached amazing valuations during their initial public offerings. And occasionally, space companies delivered exactly what they promised. So, but the trick in a situation like this, we've seen these hype markets before. You start seeing things like Harvard Business Review going, hey, your company needs a space strategy like right now. But then right behind it, Space News, which is a big publication for the space industry, so hang on just a second, we think this bubble is about to burst. And then you end up with another report just this year. So this is the World Economic Forum and McKinsey. They're now saying that no, $1 trillion is too small. We're talking $1.8 trillion by 2035. So the dialogue is kind of all over the place. And at a time like this, it's a trick to figure out what is real, what is hype, where you need to start investing, or where you need to start thinking about aligning your business's strategy or your nation's space strategy if it has one. and prepare for these markets and somehow to gain economic benefit from it. So as a person who's been in this market, at least on the DoD side, for the past 30 years, from my seat, this feels a little more real than in the past. I've seen a couple of these hype booms in the space industry going back into at least to the 1990s. Microsoft was a big investor in a company called Teledesic back in the 90s. It went bust. It was going to revolutionize the telecommunications market. Iridium came about in the last boom, and Iridium survived only because the U.S. government bailed it out because it was such a game changer for special forces, having mobile satellite phones. So we've seen these boom and bust cycles before, but I think to me the early indicators are looking a lot better than they have in the past. And if you follow this market, you might not agree with me, and we can have conversations about that either here or over beverages later on. Now, you may be most interested in the opportunities that the space economy presents itself. It's so tempting if you think back to like when the internet was really starting to take off, or other technologies were really starting to take off. There's this desire to jump right in. What's the next big thing, and where can I go tackle the next big thing? So I think the space market is a lot like other technology markets, and for myself, I would advocate that you could try to go find the next big space piece of hardware and build the next great rocket or the next great satellite. That's certainly a thing to do, but I think there's also something to be said for planting a garden. And what I mean by planting a garden is doing the fundamental things necessary so that no matter what direction the market ends up going, there are existing businesses that are going to be affected by this shift in the space economy. And so if you position yourself well, it doesn't matter what the core technology does per se, because you'll be able to absorb some of the benefit in secondary markets. So the core technology of space is this vertical axis. Vertical markets will still continue to grow for a while, but what I offer to you here tonight is that there will be opportunities in these adjacent markets, these horizontal places where space technology is going to start spilling over, or applications will start spilling over. And these are the places where, in that World Economic Forum headline that I showed you, the report that accompanies that spends a lot of time talking about these growing markets in the horizontal. And I'll spend some time on that here in just a few minutes. Okay. It's helpful sometimes, at least on the U.S. side, this is a great metaphor that I use back home, and it resonates for people of a certain generation. I talk about the U.S. commercial space industry as a shopping center. So if you're familiar with the shopping malls in the United States, maybe there's a similar model here in Ecuador, where you have large real estate taken up, and on each end of the mall is an anchor tenant, a shopping, a clothing store or something like that, that occupies the prime real estate, drives most of the economy of the smaller stores that fill up the space in between. I think this is a pretty decent analogy because in the space community in the United States, the anchor tenants are the Department of Defense and NASA. That what those two organizations do drive a lot of the space economy for Western nations. So you have the DoD on one side, you have NASA on the other, and you have your big prime contractors in there. Occasionally you'll have some smaller prime contractors in there, some services companies and some component manufacturers, all taking up all the little spaces in between your big tenants. And since I mentioned the U.S. space economy, or the commercial industry rather, I'll show you just a little bit about where the money is going, where the anchor tenants are spending their money. There we go. Here in this slide, this is showing you the Space Force and NASA budgets. This is what has been actually enacted since 2021. And with the exception of 2025, the colors got messed up a little bit there, I apologize. So what you have here is, this is 2021. Space Force is on the left, NASA's on the right. And then in 2025, this is what the Biden administration has requested. So we haven't entered 2025 yet. Congress hasn't enacted the budget yet. But you can see that in 2021, the Space Force was about $15 billion. And then by 2025, it's going to be on the edge of $30 billion. NASA has grown a little bit, but it's tapered off just a touch. Both NASA and the Department of Defense in the 2025 budget proposal are taking a bit of a haircut. There's a little bit of a drawback in the budget expenditures in space, but the basic trend, I think long term, is still going to be something like this, where there's going to be new money flowing into the Department of Defense and NASA. And it's not just NASA and the Department of Defense. It's not just the United States. In this graphic here, it's not you probably can't see it very well from here, but these are other nations where their expenditures have come from. So you have China, Japan, France, Russia, European Union, Germany, Italy, India, UK, and South Korea. These are the top space expenditures in 2022 and 2023. The point of this is to show that other nations are spending more and more money in their space arena. So the places that have cut back just a touch, Russia has fallen off significantly in the commercial launch industry following the invasion of Ukraine. That market has just all but evaporated. It doesn't exist anymore. But China continues to advance their space economy. European Union is trying to grow a little bit, supported by Germany. They're about the same year over year. India continues to grow. And even I saw a very interesting report, I think it was yesterday when I was waiting in the airport. It was a report on the space economy in the continent of Africa. How many African countries from just 10 years ago did not have a space program at all, and now they have flown satellites and have visions of building out a very, very robust space economy on the continent of Africa. And the same thing in the Persian Gulf. A couple of nations there have decided to go big in the space economy. So I mentioned a moment ago about talking to you about what the McKinsey report / World Economic Forum report was talking about. On this slide here, this highlights the key points inside of that report and my analog about horizontal and vertical markets and growing a garden, so to speak. So inside of that McKinsey report, it's very fascinating that, it's very fascinating that while expenditures in NASA and the DoD are still going to grow, if you look at compounded annual growth rates, they are not in first or second place. In fact, they're not even like in the top 10. Now, when you start with a large budget to begin with, it doesn't take much of a percentage of growth to realize actual dollars are still going way, way up. But if you're talking about high compounded annual growth rates, most of it is going to be in these markets here. And you can see that, for example, like insurance and asset management, 29% compounded annual growth rate over the next few years. Supply chain, 14%. Food and beverage, 11%. Digital communication, 12%. So this is what I mean by horizontal markets, that these are places where, as the technology matures, as the space infrastructure continues to get built out, this is the spillover effect that where companies can take advantage. So for Ecuador, what are the opportunities? If you believe the analysts at companies like Morgan Stanley, at McKinsey, and you believe me with my examples that I've given you, et cetera, what might Ecuador be able to do to take advantage of some of this growth that is on its way? Well, I'll start by stepping back from Ecuador for just a moment and talk about how the United States cultivates its ability to generate a space economy. The Space Foundation, and they're going to be working here in Ecuador, in Guayaquil, pretty soon. they produced some fantastic reports, and this is some data that I pulled from them, where they had a small publication that focused on the United States workforce development for space. And they focused on the top 10 space workforce states. And you can see them here highlighted in red. I live in Alabama. I live in Huntsville, where the majority of the space economy for the state is centered. And there are a couple of trends that jump right out if you read the report. The biggest one is that the state themselves are heavily vested in the space industry. They work very hard to cultivate the right talent and economic incentives to lure space companies to those states and keep them there. Now, Alabama has Marshall Space Flight Center. That's a NASA facility right there, so it helps that we have NASA right there. It helps that we also have a missile defense agency there, so we have a heavy defense and space, civil space presence there. But like Washington State does not have a NASA center there. It doesn't have a Department of Defense space presence there. That's all companies like SpaceX and Kuiper and other companies that have spun out of the tech industry have landed in Washington State. Same thing with like New Jersey, and I thought Massachusetts was in there, but I don't see them highlighted. So, of course, Florida has Space Force and NASA there, et cetera. Texas has Johnson Space Center, but you go out to places like Austin, Texas, there's not a space base there. There's not a space mission from NASA there, but Austin, Texas is a gigantic space hub now. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the states are heavily invested in the university system. They make sure that there are university programs that are targeted towards the industries, the aerospace industries that they want to lure in. They work with those companies to make sure that the academic courses produce engineers with the right skills. I'll tell you that one place that there is a gap is like on the business side. There's not an equivalency where the business schools are sitting down with the universities the same way that the engineering schools are sitting down with the aerospace companies to build out programs that give you good business leaders for aerospace. But still, they work to build out the STEM curriculum, the blue-collar workforce. For example, where I live, Lockheed Martin has an apprenticeship program right there in a nearby town. So kids who come out of high school with a little bit of trade school education go straight into an apprenticeship program, and in a few months they are on a production line building components for Lockheed Space and Missile Systems. But you also see that like in the case of Alabama, its key incentive, in addition to the university system, is that it's very, very affordable to live there. So just because you have a space economy doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an expensive place to live. In fact, a great advantage of Alabama, and its Chamber of Commerce advertises this very frequently, is the cost of living is much, much better there than it is in California or Washington or Colorado. And we lure hundreds, if not thousands, of people a year away from those states to come work in Alabama. So for Ecuador, certainly there are opportunities if it wanted to pursue space infrastructure. This is the vertical market that I was talking about earlier. So there's still some vertical left to be built out. A lot of telecommunication activities to be built out. I highlighted that just a few minutes ago, that right now there is an active program by several companies to make direct-to-cell phone text and voice and data, so that you no longer have to have big satellite phones like an Iridium, or you don't have to have a pizza box sized dish on the roof of your house to connect to Starlink. You eventually will be able to do that just directly through your phone. You have companies like Voyager Space that are building inflatable space stations. It's quite literally, it's collapsed like a balloon, and then it inflates in space, and then it will do things like pharmaceuticals work, manufacturing in space work, small components. We'll start with small components at first, but then you could grow into larger components there. And there are companies that are actively working to build landers for the moon or asteroids to go mine material, to go pull, extract resources from those and bring them back to Earth, or use them in situ for local needs on the surface of the moon. So that's the vertical opportunities. These things are still being built out. Of course, there's rockets and launch pads and range safety and those types of functions. And to go along with this, there are the partnerships that are building out some of the space infrastructure. Artemis Accords was mentioned just a moment ago. To me, personally, that is a fantastic thing that the nation of Ecuador has done to sign on to this. There are, I think, 42 or 43 nations now signed on to Artemis. And this is basically agreements among like-minded nations that say, hey, these are the norms of behavior for a commercial enterprise that is going to extend into space. It's how we will work with each other for resource sharing and economic development through space. Meanwhile, on the defense side, I know that Ecuador has worked with United States Southern Command and the Conference of the Space Conference of the Americas, held in Miami every year. United States Space Command just this past year did another big exercise, with Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, called Resolute Sentinel. Perhaps there's an opportunity for the Ecuador Ministry of Defense to partner with Space Command and start growing a Ministry of Defense-like capability for space. And it could approach that through what the United States Space Force calls its Regional Space Advisor Program. This was finally endorsed back in April of this year. I worked on it a little bit before I retired from the Space Force. These are places where perhaps on the national security side, Ecuador has opportunities to move into and take advantage of space. And of course, the partnerships with Milo Space Institute are going to be fantastic. Looking forward to working with Dave and the Milo team here as they come out and visit here next month. Is that correct? Yeah, coming out in next month. Now I'll transition out of this and just go to the horizontal side, taking that McKinsey compounded annual growth rate chart that I showed earlier and talk about maybe some practical applications here inside of Ecuador, some of the existing industries where this might be transformative. So I would say that this is, I use the word reimagine, but you could say innovation in this space right here, because these are the places where through innovation there might be opportunities. The McKinsey report and other reports I've read talk about the transformation that will be coming in shipping and manufacturing, supply chain and logistics. All of these will benefit from the increase of data coming from space, the precision of locating your asset, like in a big shipping yard, moving those shipping containers from point A to point B, more efficient shipping routes and trucking routes, things of that sort. The Internet of Things, how you're able to precisely geotag and locate items of interest as they're transiting around the world. So all of these supply chain-like functionalities will change dramatically in the coming years. And likewise, so will things like global financial services and consulting services and international legal frameworks. So I pointed it out in that slide earlier that while it's not high dollars, it is still a significant growth rate in the banking industry and the global financial services. Somebody has to finance a lot of this infrastructure. And as I pointed to a moment ago, business schools still haven't quite caught up to the fact that this economy exists and that it takes you need to take a banking program, a global banking program, and take those people and help them understand what the space economy looks like, so that they understand how to evaluate financial investments in this. If you look across the space industry over the past few years, there was a lot of companies went through their initial public offerings through special purpose acquisitions, special acquisition corporations called SPACs. Large numbers of those companies were not ready to go public. They just didn't have the good financial the good business structure. A lot of hype got them overvalued, and a lot of them have gone under as a result. So if you perhaps had better investment bankers, better venture capitalists who understood the market better, what it takes to operate in the space community, maybe some of those companies might not have been taken public. They would have been kept in an incubator status a little while longer. I pointed to Artemis as an example of partnerships that have been very, very, I think, beneficial for Ecuador. My comment here about international legal frameworks is to say that there are a handful of global treaties that date back to the 1970s that govern the use of space, but there's a lot of places for the legal frameworks, the international legal frameworks, to be filled in. So having lawyers who understand what space is and what the technology does and what the laws of physics dictate will be beneficial. Agriculture and environmental monitoring will be hugely affected by this, because the number of spacecraft monitoring the Earth, taking pictures all the time in various spectral bands, is just going to grow. The companies like Planet Labs and Black Sky and Maxar are taking pictures of the entire surface of the Earth every day in various spectral bands. So the ability to monitor things like the health of stock, how to put down pesticides or feed crops, how to control the harvests and measure the quality of the harvests, and to ensure that the commodity pricing on the markets is fair and equitable, that is going to shift significantly. Automated farming will become more and more of a real thing as companies like John Deere, global farming supply company, incorporate space technology into their hardware. That is like a thing. John Deere is investing in satellite technology. That is one of their lines of business now. So they can integrate space technology directly into the cab where the farmer is running the tractor. The amount of data coming off the spacecraft is also going to allow for high fidelity and continual monitoring of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. So measuring particulates, unhealthy particulates in the air, measuring how construction or development is affecting the local terrain and potentially creating environmental impacts there will become more and more realistic. In the last two slides I'll talk about is how the space technology can affect governance itself, how cities, states, and nations can actually do better things for the population that they serve. So the advent of smaller satellites is allowing for more and more commercial weather applications to be developed, and from that you'll have better ability to do disaster planning for things like hurricanes and typhoons, etc. Of course, you can't predict earthquakes, but still, like, disaster response from storms and earthquakes and other natural disasters will be better managed through space because of the rich imagery that will be coming down every day, and the ability to plan and pre-position stocks and get those stocks to the places that they need to go faster through the supply chain. For me, personally, I think that something that isn't talked about a lot but probably should be is the effect on telehealth and rural healthcare, because now with broadband connectivity through things like SpaceX and Starlink and Kuiper, you'll be able to connect rural healthcare centers with top-tier doctors that typically stay back in the cities. And you'll be able to give care to people in those environments. And likewise for rural education. So being able to connect teachers in far-off villages and give them the same access to information that is typically held back for, I shouldn't say held back, but information that typically resides in the larger cities and the larger academic areas. That will become available through the connectivity. Then the last thing I'll point to in the reimagining of governance is really this is catching bad actors. So these three slides illustrate my point. The first one is where NASA, through one of their space sensors, was monitoring methane emissions from factories, and they were able to discover which ones were violating environmental standards for the United States. So they published it, said, hey, here are the folks that look like they are violating standards. I had a question from a young lady this morning, or I'm sorry, a young man this morning about, well, what do we do with this information? Well, NASA themselves didn't do anything other than publish it, but that now allows state environmental compliance organizations and national environmental compliance organizations to go understand what's happening at this factory and determine if there's real crimes being committed. This middle picture is a place where you might say a crime is being committed, and this is illegal gold mining in the Amazon. So you can see that the effect of the deforestation and the illegal mining activities going on there. And then on the right side is illegal fishing in the Galapagos Islands. So the yellow dots that you see there in the bottom right, that is legal fishing that is occurring in that area. And then there's the blue boundary that is the environmental exclusion zone. And the red dots are boats inside fishing. And these are, this is the Chinese fishing fleet patrolling off the edge of the Galapagos, and occasionally you'll see places where they're going inside and harvesting illegally. So I think that the governance side is something that people don't talk about a lot because it's not fun to talk about, it's not sexy to talk about, but it is equally transformative as everything else I led to beforehand. So those were my prepared comments about the space economy. I hope it's given you a little bit to think about. And certainly, I'm glad to take any questions that you might have about innovation. I touched on it a little bit with how the top 10 U.S. space states approach it. I talked very briefly about Alabama, my home state. One thing I don't think I touched on, though, is how Alabama itself uses things like innovation centers like this. So we have our own, one of my offices that I used to work in is in a research park. So a large real estate area that is set aside specifically for technology companies to come in and set up shop. Everything from just consulting services to actual manufacturing of components for space systems. You can find a couple of those research parks across Alabama, and that's common actually in a lot of U.S. states. So I'll pause there and open it up for questions, and I very much appreciate you letting me come and talk to you this afternoon. Thank you.